Hey, Marilyn, how you doing over here?
Pretty good.
You about ready to go?
Yeah.
Let me check your horse, make sure it's double back. Yeah, looks good.
These are too.
This is going to be a little bit harder than anything you've done before, but I think you're going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
How you feeling?
I think I'll be able to.
I got a reason.
Questions in my head, I feel them in my heart. Answers I don't know of, I wonder where to start. I gave my will to Jesus and decided to trust Him. He gave me every reason to give up all my sin. I know what you're feeling, I've been there before. If you just let Him in, He'll be waiting at the door. I got a reason to walk the street narrow. I got a reason to fire like an arrow. I got a life that's always worth living. You gotta come along. You feel you should be running, though you know you're standing still. You know you could be something if you only knew His will. Emotions running wild and you're chomping at the bit, trying to work the pieces, but they don't seem to fit. I know what you're feeling, I've been there before. If you just let Him in, He'll be waiting at the door. I got a reason to walk the street narrow. I got a reason to fire like an arrow. I got a life that's always worth living. You gotta come along. I got a reason. I got a reason. I got a reason. I got a life that's I got a life that's always worth living.
There's a problem that's all too prevalent in our society. It's an addiction that's rarely talked about, but it's one that can wreck lives and destroy marriages. It's the problem of pornography. In this program, featuring a riveting interview with serial killer Ted Bundy just hours before he was executed, Dr. James Dobson talks about pornography and tells why it's addictive, progressive, and deadly.
My greatest concern, and one that I want to focus on a little bit with you all, is the addiction of pornography. Now, you know that hard drugs are addictive, and you know that marijuana can get a hold of you emotionally and so on, but very few people realize just how addictive pornography really is. Not so much for girls, but very much for guys. I am convinced that pornography, for some boys, not everyone again, for some boys, pornography is as addictive as crack cocaine. One exposure to a 13-year-old boy at just the right time, and he will grab that, and it will become very much a part of him and will be there for the rest of his life. Interesting thing about pornography, it functions very much like drugs. You take a little bit and it goes a long ways. But you bore with that and you take a little more, and you need more, and you need more, and you need more. So that you begin with soft core pornography. That's Playboy, Penthouse, it's airbrushed nudity, it's things like that. They call it soft core pornography. It's not illegal, it's available everywhere. In fact, the research shows teenagers are the #1 buyers in the entire Western world, the #1 buyers of not only softcore but hardcore pornography. I served on the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography for 18 months. It was one of the most miserable experiences of my life. Our responsibility was to evaluate this stuff and make recommendations to the government. And the material that we had to watch is infinitely worse than this. I won't even describe it to you, but it's terrible. And then what happens with an addiction to pornography is you go from there to a little fire trail, a little barrier, where you've seen everything that a man and woman can do together. Now what? Because, see, one of the characteristics of pornography is that you bore with it. This stage becomes boring very quickly. And then you move on to another one. And you're walking down this path. What happens when you get to the point that you've seen it all? Not everybody, again, but a percentage. That's the point. You don't know when you're in the percentage that's vulnerable to one of these doors, one of these addictive behaviors. For a percentage, they jump the fire trail. And they go to the perversions. This is how people get into child pornography. How does a man, particularly, who didn't start out this way, develop a great excitement for children, for 4, 5, 6-year-old boys or girls? How does that happen? They call it chicken porn. And until it was outlawed in 1983, it was a billion-dollar industry in this country. An awful lot of people. How did that happen? It happened typically because they walk down this path and get to that point and jump the fire trail. Sex with animals, horrible stuff. Homosexual violence. Again, I don't even want to describe for you all the stuff that we had to watch, but it is now an $8 billion industry. If you go into the sex shops in New York City and Los Angeles and Houston and places like that, you don't even find this kind of stuff. People think they sell Playboy magazines and things of that nature in there. As bad as those are, that's tame. They don't even sell them. They're not even there. What you see mostly are these things. Horrible mutilations of the body and things of that nature. Now, I wish I'd have moved this whole thing over, because the final stage of this is death. Interesting aspect of all those addictions is that when carried to their ultimate conclusion, they all lead to death. Drugs lead to death. Alcohol leads to death. You carry them to their conclusion and they lead to death. And that's the way sin is. The wages of sin is death. Ted Bundy was a nice-looking guy, an intelligent man, a normal-sounding guy. In fact, if he were here and your age and just in your midst, and I asked you to look around and select the future mass murderer out of this bunch, you would not have picked Ted Bundy. He looked like Joe College. He sounded intelligent. He was a law student at times. Went into to college and began abducting women and girls. Eventually killed 28 women and girls. The last person he killed was little Kimberly Leach in Florida. She was 12 years old. Dumped her body in a pigsty. Most horrible things. He was so clever at it that literally he could have gone on doing this almost indefinitely. He was caught on a fluke. They happened to pull him over for speeding, and they found something in his car that was suspicious, and that's how they caught him. Or he could have gone on. There's another serial murderer loose right now that I've worked with the police on. They call him the Green River Killer. And he started up in Seattle. Anybody from the state of Washington? You heard of the Green River Killer? Killed 40, 50 women up there, they think. Came down to Portland, then down to San Francisco and Los Angeles. Last I heard, he was in San Diego. And there's just one right after the other dying. They feel there's 250 plus women whom he's killed. And he's following the same pattern that Ted Bundy did. Ted's particular technique was that he had worked at a medical supply office. And so he would put a cast on his arm. There's nothing wrong with his arm, but he put a cast on his arm. And then he would be on a college campus, and he'd have what he called a mark, which is the woman that he wanted to abduct. And he would walk by her when she was alone, if he could find her, He would track her, and when he would find her, he'd walk by carrying all these books. And when he got near her, as though he didn't see her, he'd fumble and he'd drop them all. And then he'd be down there with this arm in a cast trying to bundle them up, and she would come over to help him. And he would say, can you, and it's a lot of books, you know, can you just help me get to my car? And out of kindness, she would walk him to the car. And when he got her there, he would either ask her if she could drive him just 2 blocks, or he would push her in. And once he got her in the car, he would totally disable her, hit her with a pipe or something. Horrible things. Then when he was through with her, he would dump her body in a place where it would decay before they found it, and the animals would spread the bones around, and the clothes would decay and so on. And no one saw the girl disappear, so there were never any witnesses. He could have gone on doing that forever unless he had tripped up. He was finally convicted. He spent 10 years on death row, and while he was on death row, an attorney named John Tanner and his wife Marcia took it upon themselves to minister to Ted. Sure, he'd killed 28 women, but he is still a creation of God, and he needed God like everybody else. And John and Marcia went into that prison for 200 plus hours and led him into, I think, only God knows, I think, a genuine relationship with Jesus Christ. Now that's offensive to some people. The thought of Ted Bundy going to heaven, you know, it doesn't seem right, does it? And yet the Lord said there's no sin that he can't forgive. And I believe Ted found the Lord. 2 years before he died, John Tanner called me on behalf of Ted. And he said, the Lord is talking to Ted, and he feels that he needs to admit his crimes. He needs to give information that will allow the parents and the families of the girls he murdered to know what happened to them. And he needs to confess what caused him, he thinks, to do this. And he knows the press will not allow him to get that message out because they obviously hated him, and perhaps for good reason. They said he wants to release that information through you. So a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, the telephone rang. John Tanner was on the phone. He said, the way has been cleared for the execution of Ted Bundy. He only has 6 more days to live. He wants you to come to Florida. Now, I flew down to Florida immediately. I got there just 2 days before he was to be executed. And you talk about one wild scene. It was a circus. There were 300 members of the press across the street from the prison. There were 1,000 people or more with signs, and none of those members of the press could get an interview with Ted because he wouldn't talk to them. Now here they are, the eyes and ears of the world, and they're there to interview Ted Bundy or to get a story, and he won't talk to them. The prison wouldn't talk to him, and they hear that this guy's coming in from California that has a private interview with him. I arrived and was ushered to the prison, and I went through one of the strangest, most bizarre experiences of my life. I went through 7 steel doors to get to him. I went through metal detectors that were so sensitive that I had to take my shoes off because it would react to the pins in the heel of my shoes. Tie-tack, any metal whatsoever. They finally took me into this inner chamber, and then they brought Ted in. They took him in a little room and strip searched him before he could even talk to me.
For the record, you are guilty of killing many women and girls.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
I grew up in a wonderful home with 2 dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12 or 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store, or the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible to wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment. Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
Basically, I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum, or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret, very close to myself, and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror for my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy, and I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but it unfortunately became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families. And pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I am here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted, what would your life have been like without that influence? You can only speculate.
Yeah. Well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's, excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot better for me and lots of other people. I know that. Lots of other innocent people, victims and families. It would have been a lot better. There's no question, but that it would have been a fuller life. Certainly a life that would not have involved, I'm absolutely certain, would not have involved this kind of violence that I have committed.
I'm sure, Ted, if I were able to ask you the questions that are being asked out there, one of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases, murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years later because it revives in me all those terrible feelings and those thoughts that I have steadfastly and diligently dealt with, I think successfully, with the love of God. And yet it's reopened that, and I felt the pain and I felt the horror again of all that. And I can only hope that those who I have harmed, those who I've caused so much grief, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence. And what scares me, and let's come into the present now, because what I'm talking about happened 30 years ago, that is, in my formative stages. And what scares and appalls me, Dr. Dobson, is when I see what's on cable TV, some of the movies, some of the violence in the movies that come into homes today with stuff that they wouldn't show in X-rated adult theaters 30 years ago. This stuff...
The slasher movies that you're talking about.
That stuff is, I'm telling you, from personal experience, that is graphic violence on screen, particularly as it gets into the home to children who may be unattended or unaware that they may be a Ted Bundy who has that vulnerability to that predisposition to be influenced by that kind of behavior, by that kind of movie, that kind of violence. There are kids sitting out there switching the TV dial around and come upon these movies late at night, or I don't know when they're on, but they're on and any kid can watch them. It's scary when I think what would have happened to me if I had seen. I mean, scary enough. I mean, that I just ran into stuff outside the home, but to know that children are watching that kind of thing today, or can pick up their phone and dial away for it or send away for it. But I'll tell you, there are lots of other kids playing in streets around this country today who are going to be dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day and next month because other young people are reading the kinds of things and seeing the kinds of things that are available in the media today.
Ted, as you would imagine, there's tremendous cynicism about you on the outside, and I suppose for good reason. I'm not sure that there's anything that you could say that people would believe. Some people would believe.
Yeah.
And yet, you told me last night, and I've heard this through our mutual friend John Tanner, that you have accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and are a follower and a believer in Him. Do you draw strength from that as you approach these final hours?
I do. I can't say that
it's going to be
being
easy.
in the valley of the shadow of death is something that I've become all that accustomed to, and that I'm strong and nothing's bothering me. Listen, it's no fun. It gets kind of lonely, and yet I have to remind myself that every one of us will go through this someday, in one way or another, and countless millions who have walked this earth before us have. So this is just an experience which we all share.
Yeah.
Here I am.
That was a very bizarre experience for me, as you can imagine. It looks like Ted and I are alone there talking to one another. He's handcuffed. But there was a guard standing right here and one standing right there and one back here. We were surrounded by 6 guards all the time that we did that video. You don't see it because we've cut it out, but in the middle of that video, the lights almost went out. They came down very dim. You could still see. And they were down for about 20 seconds, and then they went back up. And Ted said to me, it's all right, they'll come back on. And I wondered how he knew. Why do you think the lights went out? They were testing the electric chair. And he knew it, because he had seen that happen before. But you saw on the video his confession. What he said, 13 years of age. He's playing around his house, country road. Somebody had dumped pornography out there, stumbled onto it, got hooked on it, began to walk down that pathway toward ever more violent stuff, and it just ushered him along that path. Now, Ted was careful to say, if you heard the video, he's careful to say, pornography didn't cause me to do this. In other words, he was trying to say, I'm not trying to escape the responsibility for what I did. I take the responsibility for it. But violent pornography played a key role in his life. And then, remember what he said? He said, I have never seen a member of death row who had committed rape and had been involved in the kind of things that Ted was. He said he had never seen such a person who was not deeply into pornography. And the FBI's study showed just that it is true. Now, not everybody who gets into softcore pornography is going to walk down this path toward murder and rape. But a few are. And if it's only 20 a year, in a nation like the United States, and each one of them kills 28 women. It's too many. And yet this stuff is still sold. I want to tell you one more thing about pornography, and then I want to hear from you. I want you to talk to me about what we've been discussing here. The greatest danger of pornography for you all, because unless you're very unusual, you haven't progressed too far down this path. But there are guys here who are into this stuff. I mean, in any room of 175 people, it's going to happen because it's so pervasive. You know, you can get it everywhere. And as I said, teenagers typically are the #1 buyers of it. So, and there could be some girls involved in it too, but probably a smaller percentage. At any rate, if you're back in here someplace, the greatest danger of this stuff is not that you will become a serial murderer. Let's be serious. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. It's highly unlikely because there are very few that take it that far. It's horrible when they do, but very few. What is dangerous for you all, and what I saw as a member of this Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, and I determined as I was flying back and forth across this country to do what I could to warn people your age about this, because it's not being said. The greatest danger is that the guys especially will get addicted to this stuff and start walking down that path, and then comes the time to get married. And there is nothing about marriage that eliminates any addiction. Getting married doesn't take away the desire for drugs. Getting married does not cure an alcoholic. Getting married does not cure a gambler. Getting married does not cure a person deeply into pornography. Now you got a new problem, because men and women are very different, as you know. Men are primarily visual in nature, you know, far more so than women are. You just watch a bunch of guys when a pretty girl walks by. Come on, what do they do? I mean, they gawk, right? They turn around and stare at her when she goes by, because guys are visual. That's where the sexual stimulation comes from. That's why pornography influences men so much more than women. I went into these sex shops with that pornography commission. We had police escort. You don't find women in there. There are no women in there. There are only men in there, because it appeals to a masculine source of stimulation. Women, by contrast, are far more stimulated by romantic relationships, by touch, by somebody she knows, by a specific person. For a guy, it's generalized. I mean, a girl's walking down the street and she spent 2 hours arranging herself to score a hit on his sensory apparatus, and she's coming toward him and he sees it and he responds to it, because that's the way he's made. For women, it's very different. So when pornography comes into marriage and he's addicted to it and she's not, it drives a wedge between them. And it destroys their sexual relationship. I bet you've never heard anybody say that. Nobody tells you that. In fact, there are many husbands and wives that buy this stuff thinking that it'll spice up their marriage. And what it really does is it takes them on two separate paths. And the guy sees things in print, sees pictures and videos that make him want her to do things she doesn't want to do. And she's offended by that. And she knows it's wrong. And she pulls back from it, and he feels rejected by it. Furthermore, folks, there is nothing in reality that can possibly compete with airbrushed fantasy. You know, it just destroys desire in a marital relationship. And I hope just a comment or two like that would help. If it helped one of you and the people that are going to see this video to avoid walking down that path, I think it's well worth what we're doing here. Anybody have any comment or question? Yes.
If people like Ted Bundy do the things they do, how come hardcore pornography is so available to the public?
Because there's tremendous money to be made from it. The mafia controls 85% of it. You think about that, and they don't pay taxes on it. Most of that money is made through video booths in the sex shops where coins are put in those booths. There's no cash register, there's no receipt, there's no sales. and those things go right out the back in sacks of money, and the mafia takes that and uses it to support its industries throughout the world. So one of the reasons is because the most creative criminals in the world have good reason to sell this stuff, and they buy off officials. I have no doubt whatsoever that they contribute to the campaigns of the politicians who will help keep those laws in place. This stuff is kind of thought to be macho. Even the police don't really want to pursue the pornographers because boys will be boys, you know, men will be men. Come on, it's not hurting anybody. Victimless crime. It's not a victimless crime. Do you know that one of the primary uses for adult pornography is to open children to child abuse? See, what they do is they buy this stuff and then they show the children and they say, see, this is what mommies and daddies do. There's nothing wrong with this. Children are stumbling onto it. They're finding it. And then are being twisted and warped by it. I have an article here. This occurred just recently. 10-year-old youth is accused of rape. 10 years old. A 10-year-old boy who told the police that he learned to have sex while watching X-rated movies was arrested on charges that he raped and sodomized an 8-year-old girl and her 4-year-old sister. The boy stated that he learned to have sex while watching X-rated movies. You know, the pornographers all say, and many of the civil libertarians say, that pornography does not have an influence on behavior. Even the learned psychologists and the people in the universities are saying that. After my experience with Bundy, they came out of the woodwork. They came out of their ivory towers. They were on television all over the United States, and they were saying, pornography is just an innocent thing. It does not influence behavior. Consider this, folks. You remember the movie E.T.? You remember the moment on the screen when some candy was handed by the boy to the extraterrestrial? You remember that moment? What was that candy? How do you know that? It didn't say it. How do you know it? You recognized it, right? There was about 5 seconds or less on that screen where that took place. The sale of Reese's Pieces went through the roof. What you saw influenced behavior. People went out and bought it. Now, if that occurs from 5 seconds on the screen, what effect does the Texas Chainsaw Massacre have on young people who happen to be vulnerable to that? There are an awful lot of kids out there who are emotionally and mentally twisted and warped by what they've been experiencing. What if they have a tendency like that? See, Bundy was one of those people. And then, to be fair, there are civil libertarians, there are ACLU types who honestly believe they're protecting the First Amendment by not allowing this stuff to be restricted, that adults ought to be able to see anything they want. An ACLU member, a representative of the ACLU, came to our commission, the very first meeting we had. A very intelligent man. In fact, I like him personally. I've gotten to know him. He sat there and said to our commission that it is the position of the ACLU. You know what the ACLU is? American Civil Liberties Union? You heard about that? He sat there and said it is their position that there should be no restriction on the sale and distribution of child pornography. Which means, see, every bit of child pornography is physical evidence of child abuse. You can't make it without abusing a child. And yet it's their position that it ought to be sold and distributed. And if it's sold and distributed, there's a market for it. And if there's a market for it, they're going to be victims of it. Yet that is their position. And they honestly believe, I think, they're protecting the First Amendment. But they're wrong. Yes?
Hey, what kind of action is being taken to get the pornography off the shelves and stuff, besides the fact the lawyers are suing them? And how can they do it without running into the Amendment 1 issue?
Well, one of the things that very few people realize, because the press won't tell you, is that this stuff does not violate the First Amendment, and that the Congress passed laws saying obscenity is illegal. The President signed those laws. The Supreme Court reviewed them and found them valid in a case called Miller versus California. So the stuff is illegal. The problem is we don't have a will to go get it. And until our commission, there was absolutely no governmental effort at all to chase this stuff. Now they are doing it, and it's not just getting it off the shelves. It's going after the producers, the big boys behind the scenes, the billionaires that are producing this stuff, and we are getting them. We're sending them to, I say we, I'm not doing it, but we're sending them to jail. Yes?
What do we do, what can we do about a friend who's in the percentage of hardcore pornography? What can we do to make him realize that it's addictive and that there's a better way of life?
I really believe the only thing you can do is be an influence on him, share your views, and give him one other person in his life who sees it another way. The chances are great nobody is saying that to him. I want to ask you all, I'm not going to ask you to say it verbally, it's a rhetorical question. Your pastor's talking about this? You know, are you hearing the danger of this stuff in church? Are you hearing it at home? I mean, it's not something that people talk about. And just having one friend that will take another position will sometimes turn others around. Not always, and you can't influence everybody, but you can do what you can. You're a great group. Thank you for your openness today, and we'll pick it up tonight.